26 tutors had walked through that mansion, and 26 tutors had walked right back out. The latest one didn't even bother lowering her voice as she stormed past the marble staircase, heels clicking like gunfire against the floor. 3 weeks, she snapped, spinning around at the door. 3 weeks of sitting in that room, and she won't even look at me. I have a career. I have a life. I can't keep doing this. Kong Ji-won said nothing. He stood at the top of the stairs, in his tailored suit, hands in his pockets, watching the door slam behind her. The sound echoed through the house, the way every sound echoed through that house now. Too loud, too empty, too final. His assistant approached carefully, the way people approached him these days, like he might break.
Sir.
I know the timing is bad, but someone new has accepted the position. Ji-won didn't turn around right away. Accepted? Did you send her the file? Yes, sir. The full file. Everything about Sumin. And she still said yes? She did. He finally turned, something flickering behind his tired eyes. Not hope. Not yet, just disbelief. Hope was a luxury he'd stopped affording himself 2 years ago. Across the city, in a small office at the tutoring agency, Adiz Okafor sat with that same file open in front of her. The folder was thin, but the words inside it carried weight no folder should have to hold. Child has not spoken in 2 years. Communicates through nodding, head shaking, and eye contact only. Previous tutors report no progress. Adiz read it twice. Then, she did something the agency director hadn't expected. She smiled. Not the polite kind, but the soft, private kind, like she just recognized someone she used to know. I know exactly how that feels, she whispered to no one. The director blinked. You still want the job? I want it more now. If this story has already pulled you in this fast, imagine how the rest of it is going to make you feel. Hit subscribe and like the video now so you don't miss a single moment. Let's get into it. No one at the agency knew why a 29-year-old woman from Port Harcourt would smile at a file that had made grown professionals quit in tears. They didn't know about the 10-year-old girl she used to be, sitting at her father's funeral, unable to make a single sound come out of her throat for almost a year afterward. They didn't know grief like that leaves a map on a person. And when you've walked that map yourself, you can recognize it on someone else from a single sentence in a file. She arrived at the Kong estate 3 days later, wearing a yellow dress that felt like sunlight against all that cold marble and glass. Ji-won met her in the foyer, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ms. Okafor, he said, I want to be honest with you before you start. My daughter doesn't speak. She hasn't spoken in 2 years. Most teachers quit within the month. Some quit within the week. I read the file. Adiz said simply. Then you understand what you're walking into. I understand what she's walking through. Adiz corrected gently. There's a difference. Ji-won studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he doesn't want to let himself believe in. I'm not here to make her speak, Adiz added. I just want you to know that going in. If that's not what you're hiring me for, tell me now. He didn't answer right away. Nobody had said it quite like that before. Every previous tutor had walked in with a plan, a method, a deadline. This woman walked in with nothing but a quiet kind of certainty. Her room is upstairs, he finally said. 3rd door on the left. Sumin was sitting by the window when Adiz stepped inside, a small figure sitting on a window seat far too big for a 7-year-old. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the door opening, the footsteps crossing the room, or the woman lowering herself gently onto the carpet a respectful distance away. Hi, Adiz said softly.
I'm Daeja.
I talk a lot. Probably too much. You don't have to say anything back. You don't have to do anything at all. Sumin's eyes flicked toward her for half a second, then returned to the window.
No smile. No nod.
Nothing. Adiz didn't push. She simply opened her bag, pulled out a children's book, and began reading aloud. Not to teach, not to test, just to fill the room with a voice that didn't expect anything in return. Sumin listened. Or at least, she didn't leave the room, which Adiz understood was its own kind of answer. When the lesson hour ended, Adiz packed up quietly. Before she left, she pulled a small sticky note from her bag, wrote something on it, and pressed it gently onto the corner of Sumin's desk. You looked beautiful today. She didn't wait for a reaction. She simply smiled at the girl, said goodnight, and let herself out. The next morning, when Adiz returned, the note was gone. She searched the desk, the floor, the wastebasket, nothing. Sumin sat in her usual spot by the window, eyes forward, expression blank as ever. Adiz assumed it had simply been thrown away, the way you'd expect a child who didn't want to engage to discard something she didn't ask for. It wasn't until she sat down at the small desk to set up the day's lesson that she noticed it, tucked beneath the edge of her own notebook, where only someone sitting in that exact chair would find it. A new sticky note.
Different handwriting.
Small, careful, a child's print pressed hard into the paper, like she'd wanted to make sure it would never smudge away. It simply said, "Thank you." That single word changed something in the house, though nobody said it out loud. From then on, the sticky notes became their own quiet language. Adiz would leave one on the desk each morning. Sumin would leave one back, tucked somewhere only Adiz would think to check. Under the notebook, inside a book, folded into a paper crane once, just to see if she'd notice. She always noticed. "What food do you like?" Sumin wrote one afternoon, her handwriting growing steadier with each passing week. "Jollof rice. And plantain. Do you know what plantain is?" Adiz wrote back. A pause. Then, "No. I'll bring some tomorrow," Adiz said aloud, even though she knew there'd be no verbal answer. There rarely was. But Sumin's eyes lifted to her for a moment longer than usual, and that was enough. She kept her promise. The next day, she brought a small container of fried plantain, still warm, and set it on the desk between them like it was the most normal thing in the world. "In Port Harcourt, when I was your age, my brothers and I used to fight over the last piece," Adiz said, popping one into her mouth. "One time my brother Emeka hid a whole plate under his bed, so nobody else could have it. 2 days later the ants found it before he did." Sumin's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. Not quite. But it was close enough that Adiz had to look down at her notebook to keep from grinning too wide and scaring it away. She kept the stories coming after that, dropping them in naturally between lessons, never forcing, never performing. She told Sumin about climbing mango trees with bare feet and skinned knees. About the time she tried to cook rice for the first time and nearly burned down her mother's kitchen. About the songs her grandmother used to hum while braiding her hair on Sunday afternoons. One afternoon, attempting to recreate that very story, Adiz tried baking pancakes in the estate's enormous kitchen and managed to burn 3 in a row, filling the air with smoke and the unmistakable smell of failure. She turned around, flour on her sleeve, smoke curling behind her, and found Sumin standing in the doorway, watching, shoulders shaking slightly. Not crying, laughing. Silently, but laughing. Both hands pressed over her mouth like she was trying to keep it contained. "Oh, you think this is funny?" Adiz said, feigning offense, and Sumin's shoulders shook harder. It was the first sound of joy that House had heard in 2 years, even without a single syllable behind it. Unbeknownst to either of them, Jiwon had been standing just beyond the doorway, having come home early. He'd meant to call out a greeting. Instead, he stood frozen, watching his daughter's shoulders tremble with something that wasn't sorrow, and felt his chest tighten in a way he didn't have words for. That night, alone in his study, he found himself pulling up the security footage from earlier, not to monitor, not out of suspicion, just to watch it again. To make sure he hadn't imagined it. He hadn't. There she was, hands over her mouth, eyes crinkled at the corners. He hadn't seen that face since his wife died. He didn't tell Adiz what he'd seen. But the next morning, when he passed her in the hallway, he paused. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for whatever you're doing in there." "I'm not doing anything special," Adiz replied. "I'm just talking to her like she's still in there. Because she is." He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and walked on, though something in his chest had loosened slightly, like a knot finally given room to breathe. The notes kept coming, growing braver with each one. "Do Nigerian children climb mango trees?" Sumin asked one day. "All the time." I fell out of one once and broke my arm. Did it hurt? A lot. But I went back and climbed it again the next month. Don't tell my mother I told you that. Sumin smiled at that one. Fully. Openly. The first real smile Adiz had seen cross her face. It lasted only a second before the girl caught herself and tucked it away again, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep it. But Adiz saw it, and she made sure not to make a big deal of it, because she understood, more than anyone, that the smallest joys can feel fragile to someone who's spent 2 years protecting herself from feeling too much. Then, one quiet afternoon while they sat together coloring, Sumin wrote a different kind of note. Slower this time, like it cost her something. Did you miss your father? Adiz went still for a moment. She hadn't expected the question, not phrased so plainly, not from a 7-year-old who barely knew her. But she understood exactly what was being asked beneath the words. Every day, she said softly. Even now. Sumin looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, before returning to her coloring like nothing had happened. That night, after Sumin had gone to bed, Adiz sat at the small desk in the guest room and wrote a longer note than usual, not for tomorrow's lesson, but for the question that had been asked. She wrote about her father's laugh, about the day he died, about the year afterward where she couldn't make her voice work no matter how hard she tried, about how slowly, gently, people had helped her find it again. She slipped the note under Sumin's door before heading to bed. In the morning, she found Sumin holding it, reading it for what looked like the 3rd or 4th time, her small fingers tracing the edges of the paper like it was something precious. Sumin looked up when Adiz entered, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She held up a new note instead, written in her careful, steady handwriting. Can you sleep in my room tonight? It wasn't a request about a story or a song. It was something deeper than that, and Adiz understood at the moment she read it, a child asking in the only way she knew how if it was safe to let someone close. Of course I can, Adiz said gently, and watched something in Sumin's small shoulders ease, like she'd been holding her breath for an answer she wasn't sure would come. That night, Adiz settled onto the small cot that had been brought into Sumin's room, and Sumin climbed into her own bed, eyes following her every movement with quiet curiosity. Do you want a story? Adiz asked. A nod. She told her about a girl in Port Harcourt who was scared of thunderstorms until her grandmother taught her that thunder was just the sky clearing its throat before it sang. Sumin listened with her eyes half closed, the tension in her small body easing bit by bit. When the story ended, Adiz began to hum. Low, soft, an old Aquare lullaby her own mother used to sing to her. She didn't know all the words anymore, just the melody, but the melody was enough. She reached over and gently stroked Sumin's hair the way you'd comfort any child drifting toward sleep. Sumin's eyes closed. Her breathing slowed. And for the first time in 2 years, she slept through the entire night without waking once. Down the hall, Ji-won sat in his study, unable to look away from the small monitor he'd quietly kept since his wife passed, the one that let him check on his daughter without disturbing her. He watched her sleep, peaceful and still, her small hand curled near her face the way it used to be when she was a baby. He hadn't seen her sleep like that in 2 years. He pressed a hand over his mouth and let himself feel it. Not despair, not the grief that had hollowed him out for so long, but something gentler. Relief. Gratitude. A small, fragile hope that maybe things could be different. The sleepovers became routine after that. Adiz would stay 2 or 3 nights a week, and the rest of the house seemed to soften around the edges because of it. Sumin began waiting by the window in the late afternoon, watching for Adiz's car. She started reaching for her hand without thinking, walking close beside her through the halls. Small drawings began appearing on the refrigerator, stick figures of 2 people, one in a yellow dress, holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Ji-won found himself drawn into their orbit more and more. What started as a few minutes watching from the doorway became sitting quietly beside them during lessons, lingering a little longer at dinner, finding small excuses to be near the warmth that had returned to his house. There were moments, quiet ones, where Ji-won would catch Adi's eye across the room and something would pass between them, unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably there. Neither of them said anything about it. Neither of them was ready to. If you're starting to feel something in your chest right now, that's exactly where this story wants you. Drop a comment telling me who you think is healing more in this story, the father or the daughter. And keep watching, because what happens next is the moment everything changes. One evening, after a quiet day that had ended with Sumin falling asleep against Adi's side during a card game, Adi's carried her gently to bed and tucked her in, as she always did. The room was dim, lit only by the small lamp on the nightstand. Adi's began the bedtime story as usual, her voice low and warm. Halfway through, she noticed Sumin wasn't quite listening the way she normally did. Her small face had gone still, thoughtful, somewhere far away. "Sumin," Adi said gently, pausing the story. "Where did you go just now?" Sumin was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so soft it almost didn't register as sound at all, she whispered 4 words that hadn't left her mouth in 2 years. "I miss my mommy." Adi's did not move. She had spent years learning what to do in moments like this, and every instinct she had told her the same thing now. Stay still, stay warm, do not let your own shock show on your face. Children who have gone silent for 2 years do not come back loudly. They come back like a hand reaching out of water, testing whether it's safe to surface at all. So instead of gasping, instead of crying out in relief or disbelief, Adi simply reached over and laid her hand gently over Sumin's small one. "I know," she said softly. "I know you do." That was all it took. Something in Sumin seemed to give way at those 2 words, not because they were magic, but because for 2 years, nobody had simply said "I know" without flinching, without rushing to fix it, without turning her grief into a problem to be solved. Adi's had just let it be true. Sumin's chin trembled first. Then her breath caught, uneven and small. She turned her face into the pillow, and her shoulders began to shake. Not loudly, not violently, just the quiet, full-body shudder of a child finally letting go of something she had been carrying alone in silence for longer than she should have had to. Adi's didn't tell her to stop. She didn't tell her it would be okay, not yet. She simply moved closer, sat at the edge of the bed, and gently rested her hand on Sumin's back, the way you'd steady someone learning to stand after a long time of not walking at all. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Adi said quietly. "But if you want to, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, there was only the sound of Sumin's uneven breathing in the dim room. Then, haltingly, the words began to come. "I thought if I talked," Sumin said between breaths, "I would forget her voice. I thought if I kept quiet, I could still hear her in my head." Adi's chest tightened, but she kept her voice even. "That makes so much sense, Sumin. That makes so much sense to me. And Daddy was always working," Sumin continued, her voice small and halting. "I thought maybe he loved his work more than me. I thought maybe that's why he wasn't really there, even when he was home." "He loves you," Adiz said gently. "I promise you that. Sometimes grown-ups get lost inside their own sadness, and they don't mean to leave the people they love standing outside of it. It's not because they stopped caring. It's because the sadness gets so big, it's hard to see past it." Sumin was quiet for a while, processing that in the way children do, not with words, but with stillness. "Were you sad like this?" she finally asked. "When your daddy died?" Adiz took a slow breath. This was the part she hadn't told anyone in a long time, not even people much older than the small girl in front of her. "I was 10, she said. "And for almost a year, I didn't talk either. Not because I didn't have anything to say. I had so much to say. But every time I tried, it felt like the words would make it more real. Like if I said it out loud, I'd have to really believe he was gone." Sumin looked up at her properly for the first time since the tears had started, eyes glassy but curious. "What made you talk again?" "My mother," Adiz said, smiling faintly at the memory. "She never pushed me. She just kept talking to me like I would answer every single day, for almost a year. And one day I just did. It wasn't planned. It just happened, the same way it happened for you tonight. Sumin reached out then and took Adi's hand, holding it the way she used to hold her mother's, tight and certain. Your mother loved you so much, Sumin, Adi said softly. And she still does. She lives on in every bit of love she gave you. That doesn't go away. Not ever. Sumin's eyes filled again, but this time the tears that fell were quieter, gentler, the kind that come not from breaking, but from finally being able to put something down after carrying it alone for too long. She cried herself to sleep that night, but it was a different kind of crying than the kind that had hollowed her out for 2 years. This was release. This was relief. Adi stayed beside her the entire time, humming softly, until Sumin's breathing finally evened out and her small hand went slack in Adi's zone. Adi sat there a while longer in the quiet dark, watching her sleep, feeling the full weight of what had just happened settle over her. She thought of her own mother, of that single ordinary day a year after her father's funeral when words had simply returned to her like nothing had ever been wrong. She hadn't realized until tonight how much it would mean to be on the other side of that moment for someone else. The next morning came softly, sunlight slipping through the curtains the way it always did. Jiwon had returned from an early meeting and was crossing the hallway near the kitchen, his mind already half occupied with the day ahead, when a small voice stopped him cold. Good morning. He turned slowly, certain he'd imagined it. Sumin stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair slightly mussed from sleep, looking at him with an expression that was somehow both shy and steady. Good morning, Ji-won repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the moment disappear. Sumin nodded once, then looked down at her feet, suddenly uncertain, like she wasn't sure what came next after 2 years of silence. Ji-won crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt down in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached for her shoulders. He didn't trust his voice not to break, so for a moment he simply looked at her, really looked at her, his daughter's face, present and here and speaking, in front of him. You talked, he finally managed, his voice cracking on the second word. Sumin, you talked. I know, Sumin said simply, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at her mouth. Ji-won pulled her into his arms, holding her gently, his shoulders shaking with quiet emotion he could no longer hold back. 2 years of silence, of fear, of helplessness, all of it gave way in that single embrace, in that small kitchen, on an ordinary morning that would never feel ordinary to him again. When he finally pulled back, wiping at his eyes, Sumin studied his face for a moment, her small brow furrowing in thought. Then she asked the question that had clearly been sitting inside her for a long time, waiting for the courage to come out. Daddy, were you angry at me after Mommy died? Ji-won felt the question land somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere he hadn't let himself look in a long time. He didn't answer right away. He guided Sumin to the small table by the kitchen window, the same one where she used to sit in silence during breakfast, and sat down across from her, taking both her hands in his. No, he said slowly. I was never angry at you. Not for one single second. I need you to hear that clearly, because I think you've been carrying that thought for a long time, and it was never true. Sumin's eyes searched his face, the way children do when they're deciding whether to believe something that matters this much. Then why didn't you talk to me? She asked. Why were you always working? Why did you stop being here? The question struck him harder than he expected. He took a breath, steadying himself, because he understood that she deserved honesty, not comfort dressed up as an answer. When your mother died, he began, I didn't know how to hold both things at once. My own sadness and yours. I thought if I let myself feel everything I was feeling, I wouldn't be able to take care of you the way I needed to. So I tried to outrun it. I buried myself in work because work didn't ask me to feel anything. It just asked me to think and think and think, and that felt safer than sitting still with how much I missed her. But I needed you, Sumin said quietly, her voice small but steady. I know, Ji-won said, his voice breaking slightly. I know that now. And I am so sorry, Sumin. I was so lost in my own grief that I didn't see how lost you were in yours. I told myself I was protecting you by giving you space, by not forcing you to talk. But really, I think I was protecting myself. I didn't know how to face your sadness without falling apart in front of you. Sumin was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the same careful stillness she'd carried for 2 years, except now it felt different. Not closed off, but thoughtful. I thought you didn't love me anymore, she finally said. I thought maybe you loved Mommy more, and now that she was gone, there was nothing left for me. That could not be further from the truth, Ji-won said, his voice thick with emotion. I love you more than anything in this world. I have loved you since before you could even open your eyes. Losing your mother didn't take away 1 single ounce of how much I love you. I failed at showing you that. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wonder about it again. Tears slipped down Sumin's cheeks, quiet ones, the kind that come from relief rather than pain. I missed you, she whispered. Even when you were home. I missed you being there. I missed you too, Ji-won said, his own tears falling freely now, unashamed. Every single day. I just didn't know how to find my way back to you. I'm so glad you found your way back to me first. He pulled her into his arms again, and this time she held on tighter than before, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long while, neither of them rushing to let go, both of them finally allowing themselves to feel something other than the careful distance they'd kept for 2 long years. When they finally separated, Sumin wiped at her face with the back of her hand and looked at her father with an expression that was lighter than he'd seen and longer than he could remember. Can we have breakfast together? She asked. Like a real breakfast, where we talk. We can have breakfast together every single morning from now on, Ji-won said, smiling through the last of his tears. I promise you that. In the days that followed, the change in Sumin was nothing short of remarkable. It was as though 2 years of unspoken words had been waiting just behind a door, and now that the door had finally opened, they came pouring out all at once. She talked during breakfast about her dreams from the night before. She talked during lessons, asking Adi's question after question about Nigeria, about mango trees and jollof rice, and the songs her grandmother used to sing. She talked to the household staff, who had grown so used to her silence that some of them had to excuse themselves to wipe away tears the first time she greeted them by name. She asked Ji-won 1,000 questions a day. Why the sky was blue, why he always wore the same kind of watch, whether dogs dreamed the way people did. He answered every single one, no matter how busy his schedule, because he understood now what he had nearly lost and had no intention of losing it again. The baking sessions returned, only now they were filled with sound, Sumin directing loudly, correcting Adi's measurements with the confidence of someone twice her age, laughing freely when things went wrong. The playground trips became weekend tradition, Sumin running ahead on the swings, calling back over her shoulder to make sure Ji-won was watching, that Adiz was watching, that someone she loved was witnessing every small joy she'd been too afraid to have for far too long. The staff began to whisper about it in the kitchen, in the hallways, smiles breaking out on faces that had grown accustomed to quiet sympathy. The house itself seemed to exhale, as though it too had been holding its breath for 2 years, waiting for the sound of a child's laughter to fill it again. Ji-won watched all of it unfold with something he hadn't let himself feel in so long it had become unfamiliar, gratitude so full it nearly hurt. He found himself standing in doorways more often than necessary, just to watch his daughter be a child again, to watch her run and laugh and ask too many questions and demand a second slice of cake before dinner. One evening, after Sumin had finally fallen asleep following a particularly long and chaotic game night, Ji-won found Adiz in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the mess from dinner. She wouldn't be doing any of this without you, he said quietly, leaning against the counter. I don't know how to repay what you've given her, what you've given both of us. Adiz looked up, drying her hands on a towel. She did the hard part herself, she said. I just stayed long enough to remind her it was safe to. Ji-won studied her for a long moment, something warm and unspoken passing between them again, the same thing that had been quietly growing for weeks now, unacknowledged but undeniably present. He realized, standing there in that kitchen, that this woman hadn't only brought his daughter back to life. She had done the same for him. It happened by accident, the way most discoveries like this do. Jiwon had come looking for Adiz one evening to ask about Sumin's lesson plan for the following week, and as he approached the small guest room where she sometimes worked in the evenings, he heard her voice through the door, warm and lit up in a way that made him pause before knocking. I know, I miss you too," she was saying, laughing softly at something on the other end. "No, don't worry about that. I told you I'd handle it before I come back. Chinidu, I promised 2 more months." I counted. Jiwon stood there a moment longer than he should have, his hand frozen halfway to the door. Then he stepped back quietly and returned to his study, the lesson plan forgotten, something heavy settling in his chest that he didn't fully understand until later that night. He brought it up the next morning. After Sumin had gone off to draw at the kitchen table, the two of them left alone with their coffee. "I didn't mean to overhear," he said carefully. "Last night, you were on the phone." Adiz's expression shifted, not with guilt, but with the quiet readiness of someone who had known this conversation was coming eventually. "His name is Chinidu," she said simply. "We've been together for almost 4 years. 4 years," Ji-won repeated. "He's been patient with me," she continued. "More patient than I probably deserve. I've taken jobs abroad for years now, chasing one opportunity after another, and he's never once asked me to choose between him and the life I wanted to build. He just waits and supports me and loves me through all of it." Ji-won nodded slowly, processing this with the same careful stillness Sumin often wore. "Your contract here," he said. "When does it end?" 2 months, Adiz said. "I'm going home after that. Back to Nigeria. Back to him." The words sat between them for a long moment, heavier than either of them wanted to admit. "I should be happy for you," Ji-won finally said. "And I am. I just didn't expect it to feel like this." Adiz met his eyes, and for once, she didn't look away or deflect with humor the way she often did. "I didn't expect any of this either," she admitted quietly. "Coming here, I thought I'd help a little girl find her voice again, finish my contract, and go home. I didn't expect to feel what I've started feeling. For her. For this house. She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air clearly enough. "For me," Ji-won finished softly. Adiz didn't deny it. "It doesn't matter, though," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Because Chinita has loved me through every version of myself I've been over these 4 years, including the versions where I wasn't sure what I wanted. I won't repay that by betraying him. Not even for feelings I can't fully explain." "I understand," Ji-won said, and he meant it, even as something in his chest ached at the words. "I would never ask you to be anything other than the person you are. And the person you are doesn't break promises." They sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as honest, both of them aware that something had been named between them and that naming it didn't change what would happen next. It was Sumin who eventually asked the question neither adult had been ready to answer. She'd overheard pieces of the conversation about Adiz's contract over the following days, the way children often piece together adult truths from half-sentences and change subjects. One evening, while Adiz was tucking her in, Sumin looked up at her with an expression far too serious for a 7-year-old. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. "Like, go away and not come back?" Adiz sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. There was no version of this conversation that wouldn't hurt, so she chose honesty instead of comfort. "My job here will end soon," she said gently. "And I have a home in Nigeria. People who love me there, waiting for me. I do have to go back eventually, Sumin." Sumin's lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry the loud, frightened cry of 2 years ago. This was quieter, the steady sadness of a child who had already learned, painfully, how to sit with loss instead of being consumed by it. "Can't you become my mommy instead?" she asked, the question coming out small and hopeful, the kind of question only a child brave enough to have already survived heartbreak once could ask without flinching. Adiz felt her own eyes sting, but she kept her voice steady, kept her promise to herself that this moment would be soft, not shattering. I can't be your mommy, sweetheart, she said gently. Nobody can replace her, and I wouldn't want to try. But I want you to hear something, and I want you to really believe it. She took Sumin's small hands in hers. No matter where I live, Adiz said, no matter how far away I am, I will always be yours. You found your voice while I was here, and that voice is never going to disappear just because I'm not in the next room. You carry me with you, the same way you carry your mother. Sumin nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks, but there was something steadier in her this time, something that had grown roots over the past weeks that grief alone couldn't pull out. This story is about to take a turn nobody expects, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when Chinidu actually arrives in Korea. If you've made it this far, smash that like button and stay with me. The next part might surprise you. 2 weeks later, a message arrived that set you into motion. Chinidu was coming to Korea. Jiwon had braced himself for tension. He'd imagined 100 versions of this meeting in his head over the 2 weeks since the news arrived. A cold handshake, a guarded conversation, the particular awkwardness of two men who both loved the same woman in different ways standing in the same room. What he got instead was warmth. Chinidu arrived at the estate carrying a small gift for Sumin, a hand-carved wooden giraffe, simple and beautiful, and greeted Jiwon with a firm handshake and an easy, genuine smile that immediately disarmed whatever defenses Jiwon had prepared. Mr. Kong, Chinidu said, Adiz has told me so much about your daughter. I'm glad to finally see this house she's spoken so fondly of. Please call me Jiwon, he replied, surprised by how quickly the words came. And thank you for coming. I know it's a long way to travel. For Adiz, it's never too far, Chinidu said simply, and there was no boast in it, no edge, just plain devotion stated like fact. They sat together that evening on the terrace, while Adiz put Sumin to bed, the two men nursing cups of tea in a silence that gradually grew comfortable rather than strained. I want to be honest with you, Jiwon finally said. These past months, working alongside her, watching her bring my daughter back to me, I developed feelings I didn't expect to have. I think you should know that, rather than hear it from anyone else. Chinidu nodded slowly, unsurprised.
She told me, he said.
She's never hidden anything from me in 4 years. That's part of why I love her. And you're not angry? I trust her, Chinidu said simply. And I understand what it must have felt like, watching her heal your daughter the way she has. That kind of gratitude can feel like something more. But Adiz made her choice a long time ago, and she's never once wavered, even when she could have. Jiwon looked out over the dimly lit garden, considering this. You're a better man than I expected to meet tonight, he admitted. I'm just a man who knows what he has, Chinidu said. And I don't intend to lose it. Before he left that night, Chinidu turned to Jiwon one last time. Thank you, he said quietly, for taking care of her while she was here. For giving her a place where she could do what she does best. Jiwon understood, in that moment, with a quiet ache that settled rather than stung, that whatever he had hoped for had already been decided long before he'd met her. He had lost something he never fully had the right to claim, but he found, to his own surprise, that he could accept it without bitterness. The final weeks of Adiz's contract passed quickly, each day carrying the particular sweetness and sorrow of time everyone knew was running out. Sumin grew quieter in the evenings, not retreating into silence the way she once had, but sitting closer to Adiz than usual, as if trying to memorize the feeling of her presence before it became a memory. The day of the goodbye arrived gray and overcast, fitting for the weight it carried. At the airport, Sumin held onto Adiz's hand the entire walk to the gate, refusing to let go until the very last possible moment. When the time finally came, her composure broke, tears falling freely. Though she didn't collapse into the inconsolable grief of before, this was the clean, honest sadness of a child who had learned that goodbye didn't mean forever, even when it hurt just as much in the moment. Adiz knelt down and pulled her into a long hug, holding her tightly, memorizing the small weight of her in her arms. I have something for you, Adiz said, pulling back and handing her a large, carefully wrapped box. Don't open it until you get home. Sumin held the box against her chest like it was the most precious thing she'd ever been given. Adiz then turned to Jiwon and handed him a sealed envelope, his name written across the front in her careful handwriting. "For you," she said simply. "Read it when you're alone." Jiwon took it with both hands, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. I don't think there are words large enough for what you've done for us." "There don't need to be," Adiz said, smiling through her own tears. "I just hope you both keep doing the work. Healing isn't something that finishes. It's something you keep choosing." She hugged him briefly, a warm, simple embrace, nothing more than gratitude and goodwill passing between two people who had cared for each other in a way that circumstance never allowed to become anything else. Then she walked through the gate, turning once to wave, before disappearing from sight. That evening, back at the mansion, Sumin opened the box on her bed, Ji-won sitting beside her. Inside were 365 letters, each one carefully numbered, each one sealed, a note tucked on top of the pile. "One for every day until I see you again. You don't have to read them all at once. Just take them one day at a time, the same way you found your voice again, slowly, and without rushing." Sumin held the first letter to her chest and finally allowed herself a small, watery smile. Later that night, alone in his study, Ji-won opened his own letter. Inside, in Adiz's familiar handwriting, were words that would stay with him far longer than the ache of her leaving. "Please don't disappear into grief again. Your daughter still needs you. Not the version of you that hides in work, but the version of you I saw these past months. The one who shows up, who asks questions, who stays present even when it's hard. She found her voice because you finally let her see how much you loved her. Don't let that fade once I'm gone. Keep choosing her every single day." Ji-won folded the letter carefully and pressed it against his chest, making a silent promise to the empty room. 6 months passed the way healing usually does, not in one dramatic sweep, but in 1,000 small, ordinary mornings stacked one on top of the other. The mansion that had once felt like a quiet, beautiful tomb now hummed with the sound of 2 voices instead of one heavy silence. Breakfast was no longer a meal eaten alone in separate corners of the house. It had become a ritual, the two of them sitting together every morning without exception, Ji-won never again letting work pull him away before Sumin had finished telling him everything on her mind. They cooked together most evenings, Sumin standing on a small step stool beside him, narrating instructions she'd half remembered from Adiz's old lessons, correcting her father's measurements with the same easy confidence she'd practiced months before. Some nights they got it right. Some nights the kitchen filled with smoke and laughter in equal measure, and neither of them minded which. Each morning, before school, Sumin read one letter from the box Adiz had left behind. Some days the letters made her laugh. Funny stories about Port Harcourt, riddles, silly questions Adiz wanted her to think about. Other days they made her quiet and thoughtful, gentle reminders that grief and love could live in the same heart without canceling each other out. She kept every letter in a growing stack on her nightstand, numbered, in order, a visible record of a promise being kept one day at a time. Ji-won kept his own promise too. He read Adiz's letter to him more than once in those 6 months, especially on the harder days, the ones where old habits whispered that burying himself in work might be easier than feeling everything fully. Each time, he chose differently. He chose presence. He chose his daughter. One afternoon, Sumin came home from school with a wide smile, practically bursting to share what had happened that day. "Our teacher asked us who our heroes are," she said, swinging her school bag as she walked beside him. And I knew exactly what to say. "Oh," Ji-won asked, smiling already. "And who did you say?" Sumin counted them off on her fingers, proud and certain. "My mommy in heaven," she said first, "because she loved me even though she's not here anymore. Then my daddy." She glanced up at him, her smile softening. "Because you came back for me." "And the third?" Ji-won asked, though he already knew. "My teacher in Nigeria," Sumin said simply, "because she taught me that it's okay to talk again." Ji-won knelt down and pulled her into a hug right there on the sidewalk, his heart full in a way he never thought it would be again. That evening, as had become their own small tradition every few weeks, they set up a video call. The screen blinked to life, and there she was, Adiz, in her mother's kitchen in Port Harcourt, the warm afternoon light of Nigeria spilling in behind her, looking just as bright and steady as she always had. "There's my girl," Adiz said, grinning the moment Sumin's face appeared. "Daddy burned breakfast again," Sumin announced immediately, giggling. "Please come save us." Adiz laughed, the sound warm and familiar even through the screen. "I taught that man everything I know, and he still can't manage eggs." "I managed just fine," Jiwon said, leaning into view with a mock-offended look that made both Sumin and Adiz laugh harder. They talked for a while, the easy, unhurried kind of conversation between people who had built something real together, something that distance hadn't managed to undo. Sumin told her about school, about a new friend she'd made, about letter number 182, her favorite one so far. Adiz listened to every word the way she always had, like nothing Sumin said was too small to matter. When the call eventually came to an end, Sumin waved at the screen until it went dark, then turned to her father with a quiet, contented smile, the kind that no longer needed words behind it to mean everything. Some people, they simply arrive long enough to heal what was broken, and somehow, even from far away, they manage to stay. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, do me a favor, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, drop a like, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. There are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. I'll see you in the next video.